In the last episode, I spoke about the elemental nature of Harris stripping away all thought and leaving me in a state of flow. I put it slightly more coarsely in one of my video diaries to myself while I was leaving Luscantile.
I also need to find somewhere sheltered to sort my gear out. There is sand everywhere. My lens caps, the creases in my eyes, you name a crevice, it's in there.
I stopped off at the West Harris Trust next to Horgabost to clean my gear. I also ate at the cafe there, and while I was waiting for food I wrote this. The noise and bustle around me distracts me from my internal monologue, which has been more or less my sole companion for the trip so far. The context switch is jarring. Out in the field, my mind oscillates between two extremes. Most of the time I'm in a rush and thinking constantly, planning pieces to camera, bearing in mind narrative flow for video shots, and of course puzzling out still images. But then there are moments of ringing silence, when all my attention is on the wind, my breathing, and when I find a gap in the external stimulus, the rush of blood in my ears, and then again my mind rushes away with itself and throws up all sorts of randomness. The kinds of things my monkey mind serves me is surprising. Nursery rhymes, lines from childhood films that I watched on repeat, and songs that I haven't heard in years. Packing away my gear today earlier in Luscantile, there emerged the strapline from a credit card commercial. Some things money can't buy.
For everything else, there's MasterCard.
As I paid for my chicken burger and left the warmth of the restaurant, I felt groggy. There is something about breaking the spell and coming back to reality again. For the first time, I felt what I always think of as the turning point in the trip, where the desire to be at home in normal routines was starting to overwhelm the drive to take more photos. But today is Tuesday, and I've got to last until Friday when I'm seeing a friend in Edinburgh. So I pulled myself together and went out for another shoot.
Timed that a little bit badly. That 3-minute exposure was ruined by the incoming rain. Should have done a 6-stop. Gone for a 1-minute exposure. I don't think I'm changing out of my waterproof trousers or coat all day. Bloody hell. Kind of wish my bag was with me. It's just over there behind you.
I feel like I'm doing a lot of pieces to camera from my car, but this changeable weather and the wind is not conducive to setting up shots in the field. I know these salt flats have been done to death, but I haven't visited them before, and I really liked some of the details. The marsh flowers growing around the bank, and the foam catching in the rivulets from the wind. Of course, I got my obligatory soaking, but I was kind of glad. The wind and rain did a job for me and washed the salt and sand off my camera bag and gear. I am running low on lens cloths though. They're all getting a bit smeary, they're a bit damp and a little bit greasy. I need to give them a wash and dry them off. I'm not sure if I got anything from this afternoon's shoot. While the long exposures are sharp, I had weather fronts moving in directly at me, and the rain would hit the front of the lens before I'd finished taking the picture.
Rain spots are really difficult to remove in post, so we'll have to see whether it worked.
I was overly concerned about the raindrops. They did result in several ruined frames, but looking at these shots on the computer, they're the least of my problems. I had left Luscantire hoping for slightly less chaotic shooting conditions, where I could focus on more considered photography, but the Salt Flats were perhaps the opposite extreme, where I had a little bit too much time and I overthought my composition. The angle I settled on seems a little bit lopsided. I could blame the clouds, which were changing shape too quickly, but I also think the river in the bottom right corner runs just a little too horizontally, and it doesn't draw your eyes smoothly through the scene. Of course, I knew on the salt marshes that the storms hitting me had power, but when I add micro-contrast into the sky of this wider crop, I see Mufasa, or perhaps it's just a fox in a top hat. I left the Salt Flats and drove to the campsite at Horgabost, where I would be spending the night. I had a ferry early the following morning, so I wanted to get organised so I could leave without delay. But I had an ulterior motive too. The wind was coming from the northwest, and I thought Horgabost would be sheltered from this. There was also chatter on social media and from spaceweather.com about potential aurora that evening, and the north-facing beach would work well for this. I was tempted by Horgabost and rainbows above Nishabost on the drive past, but I stuck to the plan, and I arrived in time to set up camp before heading onto the beach for a stormy sunset shoot. There were some nice images that came from before and after the main rainstorm, but as with the previous episode on Luscantire, I can't face editing these yet. I'm sure there are some good images amongst them, but only a few stand out for immediate attention. I like this image. I like the way the pastel colours are framed by the dark clouds and the swirling black sand patterns on the beach, but there are some imperfections here. When you look closely, raindrops on the lens interrupt the clarity of the sand patterns in the foreground. I find a combination of the healing brush, remove tool, and recently generative fill does a reasonable job of removing these kinds of blemishes, but I haven't bothered in this instance. I think probably the foreground shapes and the contrasts in the centre of the frame are strong enough to keep your eyes moving through the image in spite of the rain smudges. As well as the images that don't jump out at me, there are some that attract too much of my attention, and I find them a bit overwhelming. This is a good example. Even the raw image is too dramatic, and I don't quite know what to do with it. I still have no idea how I want to crop this, and I don't know how to edit it either. I could make the argument for a low-key treatment, a high-key edit, or even a black and white conversion. I'm leaning towards high-key, but let me know in the comments which direction you would go with this. I often use the texture, dehaze and saturation sliders in an exploratory way. They help me determine how I'm going to edit an image. Shifting all of these sliders towards 100 gives you a good idea of what lies within a muted raw file. With the secrets of the image revealed in this way, I choose my crop and I make mental notes of the areas of colour and tonal contrast that I may want to emphasise with the edit. Though this shot relies too heavily on dramatic light and less so on composition, I'm still pleased with it. Aside from the hazy light piercing the rainstorm, I like that the mountains of North Harris are barely visible beyond Terrancey and Luscantire. I also like the dramatic shapes of the clouds above these faint outlines. Despite my hopes, the aurora alert stayed quiet this evening, and I left Harris without any night images at all. But I would get my first glimpse of the Northern Lights on this trip, and some photos too. You'll have to watch the last episode to see how that goes. Next week though, I'm back on the Isle of Skye. I'll see you then.